Sarah Palin, the former governor of Alaska, who was the 2008 Republican vice presidential nominee, the second woman to ever be nominated for vice president by a major political party, and the failed 2022 congressional candidate in Alaska, is probably one of the most undeveloped cases of a politician I've ever seen. I was reading some old materials recently from the time where she was governor, like 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. And I said to myself, how does someone go from being the most popular governor in America? This lady had an 80 something, 90% approval rating back in 2007 to not even being able to win a House seat in her own state. Now, granted, that House seat is not like most other ones in that it represents the whole state, but you would think someone that was that popular back then would be well liked enough to win a House seat in the state that leaned toward their own party. But she failed. And so much commentary has been made about how Palin being picked by McCain for VP was a precursor to the Trump era. You know, this idea of like the outsider person who's blunt or whatever, that's seen as something that led to Trump's eventual victory. And sure enough, Palin did endorse Trump in 2016. But I'm old enough to remember the ramblings before 2012 and 2016 that Palin was going to run for president and possibly, catch some percentage of the vote, because after her 2008 loss in the election as the running mate for McCain, she, out of anyone in that race, left it with the largest amount of visibility in terms of here was this one-term governor who had only been governor for 2 years before the election in a state that's really not that big, who just rose up in prominence because of being selected for the number two position for this very elderly candidate, referring to McCain. And I always thought her choice to resign was like just one of the most insane things I've ever seen. Just, what logic was there? Then her excuse was that she spent a whole bunch of money on trying to combat stories that were printed about her and millions of dollars and just some series of excuses. But I thought about it and I said, if you look at her actual term as governor before being McCain's running mate, because she did spend the last several months, or I guess the duration of 2009, just kind of starting to chase fame. But if you look at her term as governor, there was a general consensus that this was a lady that bucked with her party, who was in favor of cutting taxes and just doing things that it didn't seem like the rest of the Republicans in her state or nationwide seemed to really support or be in favor of doing. And when I think about the popularity she had back then, the national profile she had after the 2008 election, she completely failed to capitalize on it in any way that would remotely lead to something prosperous for her career or for the nation. And I just think it's really kind of sad in a way. Like, a lot of people have this idea of her as this stupid person. I can see Russia from my house, and I think it was the Katie Couric interview. What magazines you read? Oh, all of them. Just stuff that she said that wasn't very bright in the opinion of many people. But my thing is, in retrospect, I've watched politicians be able to get away with more egregious things. Trump giving out Lindsey Graham's phone number and then, making fun of McCain's war hero status. And, we can talk about Biden's gaffes as well, with corn pop and the various other comments that he's made. So what I'm getting at is politicians have no shortage of saying weird or dumb things and then coming back either years later or in some cases months later and being able to ward off the things they said and still be successful. Which means that if Palin were to have stayed as governor and just focused on her state, all those comments that she made back in 2008, because if you're talking about her serving out 2 full terms as governor, that takes us to 2015. I'm 90% sure that almost no one would be bringing up as she's trying to figure out how to improve her state, what magazines do you read? Because it just wouldn't be a big deal anymore. It wouldn't be something that mattered after the election was over. But since she resigned so quickly after that election, within months of it, she never got to have that period of just continued national exposure without the baggage of being mostly associated with a failed attempt at running for the White House. Honestly, in a lot of ways, she reminds me like, or other, I guess you could say Haley is like her modern equivalent in the sense that Haley doesn't really say things that are considered like people don't necessarily see her statements as dumb, but more so just they'll like genuinely disagree with it. And it's another example of like the first, woman governor in their state, and at the time they're elected, they're popular or well liked, and then after like a few years or at a later point, the people can't stand them or really just are kind of done with them. So like you see Palin is not really well liked in Alaska anymore, as evidenced by her losing that House race. And then you see that Haley is not really well liked in South Carolina anymore after losing the state to Trump. You know, just really an interesting parallel where they get elected governors of these states, and then after a handful of years, the people are just sick of them. But with in bringing up Palin's comments, I'm simply saying that those are things that stuck with her mainly because she never got to govern for a consistent number of years after the 2008 election. And I do believe that if she had stayed as governor for 2 full terms and gotten some speech writers, some better advisors, some people who could sit her down and say, listen, uh, if you have something you think you should say, at least run it through us. Let us think it out first. Some of this stuff you might end up getting yourself in trouble with. I believe if she had people like that who could take her aside and say, we want to actually talk about this and sort of get an idea of how this will work, and she had just stayed as governor for 8 years up until 2015, there is an extremely strong chance that she would have been able to run for president in 2016, and if not win, at the very least come very close to getting the Republican nomination. I'm not even trying to be funny, because a lot of when people make the comparison between her and Trump, they're accurate in many cases. It was like the unfiltered anti-establishment thing. And even if she didn't run in 2016, I think she would have been a top contender for Trump's running mate, because even back then, Trump was trying to get a woman as his VP. That's why he publicly floated Oprah, who, of course, would never actually consider running with him. And then he also was talking to Joni Ernst, and her husband derailed that. But I could completely see Palin being someone that he would consider if she was a 2-term governor who was just freshly out of office from the year before, and had, kind of like laid the foundation for a lot of his own positions. People like Ross Perot, for example, get credited for laying much of, and Pat Buchanan, for having these like presidential campaigns that kind of paved the way for Trump in a sense. And even though Palin hadn't run for president, her vice presidential candidacy would be another part of that same thing of like, hey, here's this person that has this kind of supposed authenticity, and people are that resonates with some people. Maybe not enough to win this time around, but still. And I was even saying that, a lot of people don't think Hillary is stupid. They think she's evil. They think she's demonic, but they don't think she's dumb. I believe pretty much any politician, besides maybe someone like, well, I'm not going to say his name. I don't even want to mention him here, but most of the Republicans, if they run a certain way, can appear likable compared to Hillary. And I do think Palin is more likable than Hillary, and that would be a factor in her being able to defeat her in a general election, or at the very least, help Trump defeat her if picked as the running mate in this hypothetical version of 2016. And it's easy for someone to say, oh, well, Palin is stupid. It's like, you can keep claiming that, but Hillary in real life lost to a game show host, which shows her own inept ability to campaign. So I have no doubt in my mind, if they pick somebody else who was considered more likable and like more of a moderate in terms of the way they spoke and whatnot, they'd be able to pull off the same gambit. And many of the Republican voters would be united behind the two-term governor, right? And then the person who's never had any experience referring to Trump, but still is like a successful businessman, because their whole thing is, we love when people are self-made, even though Trump inherited his money from his dad. Uh, so that's really what I've noticed about Palin, that she is a perfect example of what happens when someone has a lot of promise as a politician. They just don't capitalize on it. She had name recognition back in 2000, 8, 9, 10, that 90% of politicians will never have. No matter how hard they try, no matter how many times they get their name in the paper, they just will never be as well known as this lady was at that period. And she really did nothing with it. She resigned from office less than a year after the presidential election, started chasing this reality show crap. And I find it very sad in a way, because you look at Paul Ryan, right? Get this guy in the House. He's not really that famous before being Romney's running mate, but still, he at least becomes speaker, right? A few years later, you look at someone like Pence, who, even though he's been completely overshadowed by Trump, he still tried to run for president. It came up extremely short, but still. Same thing with Quayle. I mean, it's just to look at Palin and see her in this long line of these VP candidates, where you have national recognition just bestowed upon you by being picked for this position that most members of your party probably would dream of having. Out of any of the ones that have been picked in the last 20, 30, 40 years, she has without a doubt wasted the most of anybody. And that's sad too, because like I said, I don't dislike her any more than the rest of the Republicans, and I do think that in some areas she's better than many of the members of her party. So it's just another example of when people have potential is great, but it's only good if you actually do something with it. If it's not capitalized on, it might as well not even exist.